Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up if you enjoy the content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Dracula, A Love Tale, 2025. The year is 2025, and the familiar gothic gloom of Bram Stoker's classic tale is refracted through a modern lens in Dracula, A Love Tale. We find ourselves not just in Victorian London, but navigating the sleek, high-stakes world of international finance and digital artistry, where the ancient thirst for control meets the contemporary hunger for immortality through influence. Our Count Dracula, now portrayed with a chilling, understated elegance, is less a monstrous brute and more a titan of industry. He has spent centuries cultivating an empire, his true nature hidden behind the carefully constructed facade of a reclusive billionaire investor. This iteration of Dracula, steeped in the melancholic wisdom of endless life, finds his focus drawn not just to sustenance, but to a profound, almost intellectual longing for connection that he has long suppressed. Enter Mina Harker, whose modern counterpart is not a simple schoolmistress, but a brilliant, rising star in digital art and virtual reality design. Inspired perhaps by the early pioneers of interactive media, her work is deeply evocative, weaving complex emotional narratives into immersive digital spaces. She possesses a sharp, almost intuitive understanding of human connection, a quality that immediately intrigues the ancient predator. Her fiancé, Jonathan Harker, is depicted as a driven, perhaps overly ambitious young architect whose relentless pursuit of a career-defining project in Eastern Europe unknowingly leads him directly into Dracula's ancestral domain. The initial encounter, the journey to the shadowed castle, feels less like a kidnapping and more like a seduction into a gilded cage of historical grandeur and intellectual stimulation. Dracula, drawing on centuries of accumulated knowledge, engages Jonathan in debates on art, history, and the fleeting nature of human endeavor, subtly weakening the young man's resolve and setting the stage for his own corruption. When Dracula arrives in London, the atmosphere shifts from isolated horror to pervasive urban anxiety. He doesn't stalk shadows so much as he subtly manipulates market trends and social networks. His arrival mirrors the infiltration of a powerful, unregulated corporation into the delicate ecosystem of London society. The introduction of Lucy Westenra, Mina's close friend, is vital. In this version, Lucy is portrayed as an influential social media personality whose vibrant public life makes her an irresistible target, a beacon whose essence, when drained, promises a particularly potent form of vital energy. Her slow decline is agonizingly modern. The symptoms are initially dismissed as stress, fatigue, or the side effects of an obsessive digital lifestyle, until the true blood-soaked pattern emerges. The arrival of Professor Abraham Van Helsing is a masterstroke of casting. He is not merely an old academic, but a retired but highly respected forensic psychologist and expert in obscure historical belief systems, perhaps having cut his teeth analyzing cold cases rooted in folklore before turning to academia. His methods are meticulous, blending modern psychological profiling with ancient lore. He recognizes the pattern where the authorities see only a string of bizarre medical anomalies. The hunt for Dracula becomes a collaborative effort between this enlightened scientific mind and the desperate figures around Mina and Jonathan. Mina, reeling from Jonathan's terrifying experiences and Lucy's tragic demise, finds herself drawn into Van Helsing's investigation, her artistic mind providing unusual insights into the psychology of the hunter. The climax trades dusty crypts for sterile, high-tech environments, perhaps a subterranean server farm or a forgotten vault beneath Dracula's London headquarters. The pursuit is driven by logic, deduction, and a desperate race against the clock. Dracula's connection to Mina deepens throughout this chase. He sees in her not just a victim or prey, but a potential partner, someone whose vibrant creativity could revitalize his stagnant eternity. He attempts to bridge the vast chasm between his immortal cynicism and her passionate human existence. In the final confrontation, the destruction of Dracula is handled with a tragic inevitability. It is less a glorious slaying and more a necessary mournful severing of an ancient tether. His defeat is achieved not just through stakes and sunlight, but through the unwavering conviction of human love and intellectual clarity that Mina and Van Helsing embody. The lingering impression is that while the monster is gone, the allure of that dark, eternal power, the seductive promise of escaping the mundane boundaries of life, remains a potent, dangerous idea in the modern world. The pervasive sense of dread that settles over 2025 London after Dracula's arrival is palpable, echoing the anxieties of an interconnected society suddenly aware of how easily its foundations can be undermined by unseen forces. Count Dracula's elegance, as we observe him navigating charity galas and exclusive art auctions, is almost a performance art in itself. He moves through these spaces not seeking attention, but absorbing influence, his centuries spent observing humanity having honed him into the ultimate social engineer. One can almost picture him having quietly financed pivotal scientific discoveries throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, not for the science itself, but for the residual power it granted him in the modern era. His pallor is not merely lack of sun, it is the deep, tired look of someone who has seen every human drama played out countless times, leaving him perpetually detached, yet yearning for genuine novelty. Mina Harker's artistic career is defined by her pursuit of authentic immersion. Having trained initially in classical architecture, a subtle nod to her fiancé's profession, she pivoted when she realized digital space allowed for instantaneous, total emotional transfer, a feat physical reality always denied her. Her vulnerability stems from this very intensity. She throws herself into her creations with a desperate sincerity that Dracula perceives as raw, unfiltered life force. When she first studies the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Jonathan after his return from the Carpathians, her forensic analysis of his trauma mirrors the very techniques Van Helsing will later employ. She sees cracks in his digital facade that others miss. Jonathan Harker, the architect, is shown in flashbacks struggling under the pressure of his ambition. We see him in sterile, illuminated construction sites, his blueprints representing an ordered world he desperately wants to impose on chaos. His trip to Transylvania was meant to secure a commission involving the restoration of ancient, possibly forgotten estates, a perfect lure for an entity obsessed with legacy. His memories are fragmented, tainted by the hypnotic quality of Dracula's ancient library, where the heavy scent of aging parchment and cold stone induced a kind of Stockholm syndrome fueled by awe. He returns not just traumatized, but subtly rewired, his professional focus momentarily shifted toward constructing labyrinths and inaccessible structures, echoing the castle that consumed him. Lucy Westenra, the influencer, embodies the era's obsession with curated perfection. Her vibrant online presence, a constant stream of filtered sunlight and manufactured joy, makes her decline all the more shocking when it breaches the digital surface. When the attacks begin, the commentary sections underneath her posts become battlegrounds, some users blaming stress, others speculating about experimental cosmetic treatments gone wrong. Her exhaustion is the exhaustion of maintaining an impossible standard, which Dracula exploits by offering a perverse form of respite through emptiness. Her transformation into a predatory figure, though brief, is laced with tragic irony. She becomes what the online world demands, a beautiful, consuming obsession. Professor Van Helsing is beautifully realized as a man who rejected the rigidity of purely quantitative science. His previous career involved deep dives into historical accounts of mass hysteria and ritualistic behavior, leading him to conclude that foundational myths often contain kernel truths masked by metaphor. He carries the quiet authority of someone who has wrestled with the impossible and found documentation for it. When he examines Lucy's strange wounds, his immediate focus isn't the blood loss, but the psychological imprint left on the living, recognizing the signature of an intelligence operating outside known parameters. His initial meetings with Mina are fraught with tension. He respects her intelligence, but fears the emotional entanglement she has with the suspect entity through Jonathan and Lucy. The narrative arc builds toward a confrontation where logic must confront the illogical. Mina and Van Helsing are not just hunting a vampire, they are trying to quarantine an ideological infection. The final sequence, moving through the underground infrastructure beneath the city, a space that represents the buried history and forgotten foundations upon which modern life precariously rests, is visually stunning. Dracula, cornered, stops fighting with brute force and resorts to pleading, his voice laced with millennia of loneliness. He offers Mina everything: the knowledge of the ages, freedom from mortality's constraints, and an end to the constant, draining effort of creation that defines her human existence. Her refusal is rooted in the beauty she finds in transience. The very ephemerality he despises is what gives her art and life its meaning. The destruction, therefore, is a triumph of commitment to the flawed, finite human experience over the sterile perfection of endless being. The final, desperate act against Dracula takes place not in a dusty churchyard at dawn, but within a heavily fortified, subterranean data center owned by a shell corporation Dracula controlled. This location, filled with the low hum of powerful cooling systems, symbolizes the cold, calculated nature of his modern immortality, a reliance on infrastructure rather than superstition. The air down there is recycled, sterile, and devoid of the living warmth that Dracula both craves and destroys. As Van Helsing directs the tactical assault, his face is etched with the weariness of a man who has seen too many shadows confirmed as reality. He relies heavily on Dr. Seward, who, in this 2025 setting, is depicted as a leading cognitive behavioral therapist specializing in treating deep trauma induced by social isolation and digital manipulation. Seward's role is crucial. He manages Jonathan's fragility, recognizing that Harker's mind, broken by the supernatural, can be a weak point or, conversely, a surprising weapon. Jonathan, driven by a desperate need for atonement, for leading Mina into this danger, and for his own weakness in the castle, becomes the one who ultimately navigates the labyrinthine security protocols of the center. Mina, meanwhile, experiences the connection with Dracula not as mere psychic intrusion, but as a torturous stream of data overload. When Dracula attempts to mentally dominate her, she is flooded with fragmented memories of his entire existence: the fall of empires, the taste of blood in Roman camps, the intellectual isolation of the Renaissance courts. Her digital artistry training ironically prepares her for this onslaught. She learns to partition the incoming sensory garbage, analyzing the data streams rather than drowning in them. This internal struggle mirrors the film's central theme. Can human creativity process and neutralize infinite, ancient power? The emotional core of the confrontation is deeply personal. When Dracula corners Mina amidst racks of blinking servers, his plea is profoundly sad. He describes humanity's cycle of creation and destruction as pathetic, a fleeting spark against the backdrop of geologic time. He offers her the ability to curate history itself, to build worlds that never decay. For a moment, the temptation is almost irresistible. The artist longs for permanence. Her sharp retort cuts through his grandeur. She points out that his endless existence has rendered him incapable of surprise, his wisdom merely a catalogue of regrets. "You own everything, Count," she tells him, her voice steady despite the terror. "But you feel nothing new. That is the real death." The true vulnerability of Dracula is revealed when Van Helsing's team, guided by an electronic blueprint Jonathan helped draw from his fragmented memory, manages to overload the environmental controls. The sudden, jarring shift from the controlled climate to searing heat, mimicking a sudden, inescapable sunrise in their underground bunker, causes the Count genuine physical distress that transcends mere weakness to sunlight. It's the disruption of his perfect, controlled environment that truly shatters him. His end is not sudden. It is a slow, agonizing disintegration, as his physical form fails to integrate with the harsh reality surrounding him. As he dissolves, the physical residue is less blood and more fine, crystalline dust, like corrupted magnetic tape spilling out onto the sterile floor. The final shot focuses on Mina, not celebrating, but looking at the dust with a profound, almost scientific melancholy. She understands that in destroying Dracula, she hasn't eliminated the idea of ultimate power and escape. She has simply made the world safe for another generation to try and engineer their own imperfect, finite masterpieces. The silence in the data center afterward is heavy, filled with the weight of the knowledge they now share, a knowledge that forever changes how they view the ephemeral beauty of their own rapidly passing lives. The aftermath of Dracula's demise casts a long, complex shadow over the survivors, forcing a recalibration of their understanding of reality and ambition. The immediate aftermath is characterized by a cautious return to the light, yet the experience has permanently etched itself onto their professional and personal trajectories. Mina, having stared into the abyss of eternity, finds her art transformed. Her digital creations lose their earlier preoccupation with smooth, achievable immersion. Instead, they become jagged, honest explorations of entropy and the beauty found in decay. She starts working on a project codenamed Ephemeral Echoes, a complex VR environment that forces the user to experience sensory input that fades immediately upon perception, a deliberate rejection of the permanence Dracula offered. Her insights into deep psychological manipulation, gained through her forced communion with the Count, make her a formidable voice in digital ethics, often clashing with tech moguls who still chase forms of immortality through data hoarding and extended life technologies, a legacy Dracula inadvertently championed. Jonathan Harker, scarred by the claustrophobia and terror of the castle, experiences a complete professional pivot. The rigidity of architecture suffocates him. He channels his obsessive need for detail and structure into historical preservation consultancy, specializing in verifying the structural integrity of ancient sites threatened by modern development, working closely with international heritage organizations. He finds solace in protecting tangible, imperfect history, a direct contrast to the abstract, corrupting allure of Dracula's influence. His relationship with Mina deepens into a bond forged in shared extremity, grounded by a mutual, sober appreciation for the present moment, rather than future promises. Professor Van Helsing, the intellectual warrior, retires definitively, but remains influential, becoming an unofficial, high-level consultant for global security agencies grappling with threats that defy conventional scientific explanation. He sees Dracula's defeat not as a final victory, but as a successful quarantine of a dangerous pathogen. He dedicates his final years to creating a comprehensive, cross-disciplinary archive, the Codex Umbra, meticulously cataloging all documented instances where mythological archetypes intersect with moments of significant societal or technological upheaval. He worries less about the blood drinkers and more about the next ambitious individual who might mistake eternal control for true enlightenment. His final lingering concern is that the world, so eager to dismiss the supernatural as mere metaphor, is blinding itself to the real darkness brewing in the unchecked pursuit of innovation. The world quickly seeks to rationalize the bizarre events surrounding Lucy's death and the sudden implosion of Dracula's holding company. The official narrative settles on a complex case of corporate fraud, leading to mass hysteria and unfortunate medical complications, a neat, easily digestible explanation that allows the financial markets to stabilize. However, for the small circle who fought in the dark, the silence that follows is not peaceful closure, but a vigilant pause. They carry the knowledge that the ancient hunger for dominance simply adapted to the 21st century, trading castles for skyscrapers and cloaks for tailored suits, waiting patiently for the next vulnerable frontier to exploit. The true horror, they understand, is that the monster was not destroyed, but merely evicted, leaving behind the very architecture of desire that allowed him to thrive in the first place. The quiet vigilance maintained by Mina, Jonathan, and Van Helsing evolves into a unique form of shared guardianship, a silent pact against the specter of unchecked power lurking just beneath the veneer of technological progress. Mina's artistic evolution becomes particularly telling. Her new works are not just aesthetically challenging, they feel almost diagnostic, exposing the hidden frailties in the digital infrastructure everyone relies upon. One installation, The Glimpse, presents a user interface that appears perfectly functional until the user attempts a complex action. At that precise moment, a split-second overlay flashes, a distorted, predatory smile, before the system immediately self-corrects, leaving the user questioning their own perception. This reflects her enduring battle against Dracula's lingering mental influence, a constant need to verify reality against intrusive suggestion. Jonathan, immersed in his work, verifying the structural integrity of centuries-old stonework, finds a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction in things that endure, despite flaws. He develops a meticulous focus on microfractures, understanding that true strength lies not in flawless design, but in acknowledging and managing inevitable stress points. He often visits old European cathedrals, tracing the lines of ancient masons, finding a reassuring honesty in their enduring, visible repairs. He sometimes catches himself overanalyzing the structural weaknesses of modern glass towers in London, subconsciously looking for the invisible weaknesses that might allow a colossal shadow to slip through. His ambition is now channeled entirely into preservation, a quiet penance for his earlier desire to build grand, perhaps hubristic structures. Van Helsing's Codex Umbra grows into a massive, encrypted digital library, painstakingly cross-referencing historical accounts of plagues, financial collapses, and sudden political shifts with astronomical and geological data. He posits that extreme concentrations of human desire and fear act as gravitational anomalies, creating localized tiers in the fabric of predictable history, ripe for exploitation by beings like Dracula. He maintains regular, heavily secured video calls with Mina, often discussing obscure Babylonian tablets or forgotten alchemical texts, treating their conversations less like intellectual exercises and more like essential maintenance checks on the world's invisible defenses. He views the modern reliance on instantaneous data transmission with deep suspicion, seeing it as an unprecedented amplifier for subtle, malign influence. A highway where Dracula's spiritual essence could easily travel without physical constraint. The broader society, having neatly filed away the scandal, becomes ironically more susceptible to the very forces they dismissed. The emptiness left by Lucy's shocking departure is swiftly filled by a new wave of digital zealots promoting extreme forms of asceticism online, promising transcendence through digital detachment, a sanitized, consumer-friendly version of the eternal emptiness Dracula embodied. Mina observes this trend with a chilling recognition. The human desire for escape remains an infinite resource. She and Jonathan often attend highly exclusive, low-profile gatherings of former colleagues, finding themselves exchanging glances that convey volumes, the secret knowledge of having witnessed absolute evil wearing impeccable tailoring. They live not in fear of a recurrence, but in the sober certainty that the seed of the ancient hunger has simply found richer, faster soil in the interconnected 2025 world, ready to sprout again when the right confluence of ambition and despair aligns. Their victory was not the eradication of darkness, but the successful, temporary dimming of its brightest light. The enduring psychological toll manifests uniquely in each survivor, shaping their public personas into carefully constructed defenses against intrusion. Mina, now a celebrated but fiercely private digital artist, begins to incorporate elements of obfuscation into her artistic practice itself. She develops proprietary encryption algorithms that aren't designed to protect secrets, but rather to deliberately introduce controlled, manageable noise into her data streams. This technique, born from filtering Dracula's chaotic mental projections, becomes her shield, making her presence in the digital sphere both powerful and frustratingly indistinct to casual observers. She refuses all interviews about the Transylvania incident, allowing the public to mythologize the vacuum, preferring that the narrative remain vague rather than risk revealing the specific vulnerabilities she uncovered. Her home life with Jonathan becomes a sanctuary built on radical transparency with each other, juxtaposed against a world where everything else feels like a potential trap. Jonathan's architectural preservation work takes on an almost religious fervor. He starts documenting not just the physical structures, but the emotional weight embedded within the materials, the way wood warps under historical stress, the subtle settling of foundations under generational pressure. He publishes a highly theoretical treatise on architectural empathy, arguing that buildings retain echoes of the emotional states experienced within them. This book, while lauded by academics for its philosophical depth, serves a deeper, personal function. It's his way of proving to himself that physical reality, however flawed, possesses an inherent, verifiable truth that the seductive illusion of the immortal entity lacked. He often finds himself staring at his own reflection in polished steel and glass facades, searching for any hint of the haunted emptiness that once consumed him, reassured only when he sees the familiar, honest exhaustion of a man who sleeps deeply, if sometimes fitfully. Van Helsing, sensing the ideological vacuum left by Dracula's defeat, begins to engage indirectly with the burgeoning field of transhumanism, viewing it with the detached intensity of a biologist observing a new, highly infectious strain of mutation. He uses his academic standing to inject cautionary notes into debates about radical life extension and consciousness uploading. He doesn't outright condemn the pursuits, but relentlessly demands ethical frameworks based on the value of finitude. His lectures become mesmerizing, weaving Darwinian principles with existential philosophy, always concluding with the stark reminder that the desire to escape natural limits often paves the way for unnatural domination. He has developed a particular skepticism toward artificial general intelligence research, convinced that any truly boundless, synthetic mind would inevitably replicate the isolating hubris that characterized the Count. His private work on the Codex shifts to anticipating the next, less overtly monstrous manifestation of the eternal craving, perhaps a self-replicating code or a philosophical movement designed to subsume individual will in the name of collective perfection. The three figures remain connected by encrypted channels that function outside mainstream networks, a contingency plan for a threat they know is inherently cyclical. They recognize that while the physical body of Dracula was destroyed, the concept of absolute, timeless mastery, the ultimate control over narrative and existence, is a far more resilient vampire, thriving on the unchecked ambition that fuels the 2025 world. Their shared silence is the sound of eternal vigilance, a recognition that heroism in this new era is not about slaying a beast, but about ceaselessly defending the integrity of the finite, messy, and ultimately precious human experience against the seductive siren call of endlessness. The enduring silence that settled after the fall of the subterranean fortress was, for Mina, the most profound form of communication with Jonathan. It was the silence of shared trauma, acknowledged and integrated, a counterpoint to the overwhelming noise of the digital world they both now navigated with wary expertise. She began mentoring a small cohort of art students focusing on digital archaeology, recovering and studying intentionally deleted or corrupted data. This was her way of honoring the chaos Dracula represented, treating digital erasure not as failure, but as a historical artifact demanding interpretation. Her emotional landscape was marked by a new, fierce protectiveness over small, tangible beauties. The way morning light hit dust motes in Jonathan's study, the imperfect texture of handmade paper. This appreciation for the ephemeral was her ultimate triumph over the Count's desire for static perfection. Jonathan, finding purpose in safeguarding the past, developed an unusual, almost paranoid respect for the natural processes of decay. During an inspection of a crumbling medieval cloister in rural France, he noticed how lichen growth, an entirely natural form of slow consumption, was inherently different from the rapid, parasitic drain of the vampire. He began documenting these natural processes obsessively, sketching the slow march of entropy as a form of spiritual meditation. His conversations with Mina often circled back to the sensory details of the castle. The way the air felt cold against the skin, the particular scent of the damp stone, not to relive the fear, but to ground themselves in undeniable physical sensation. He understood that Dracula had tried to turn him into a detached observer of history. Now Jonathan was determined to be an active participant in the material world's ongoing story, however flawed that world might be. Van Helsing, nearing the completion of his Codex Umbra, understood that the next threat would likely not wear a recognizable costume, but would emerge from an intellectual premise gone rogue. He became obsessed with the philosophy of determinism as espoused by certain Silicon Valley futurists. He saw the belief that all human experience could eventually be mapped, predicted, and optimized as the intellectual successor to Dracula's desire for total control. His greatest fear was not a physical monster, but the willing surrender of human agency in exchange for perceived optimization. He started leaving cryptic, anonymous comments on academic preprint servers, using highly technical language to puncture overly confident theories of technological singularity, subtly steering the conversation back toward the necessity of chaos, surprise, and the sacred right to be utterly irrational. He viewed this intellectual guerrilla warfare as his final duty, ensuring that humanity remained messy enough to be unconquerable. The final, lingering emotion binding them was not victory, but a profound, weary understanding of the cyclical nature of ambition. They were not heroes who closed a book. They were guardians tending a fragile garden against an ever-present frost. They knew that somewhere, a new visionary was likely reading the faint, sanitized records of the financial collapse that ended Dracula's empire, not seeing a warning, but seeing a blueprint for a faster, cleaner takeover. And for Mina, Jonathan, and Van Helsing, the only defense left was to live their finite lives with such sincere, passionate engagement that their very existence served as a quiet, unassailable testament against the allure of forever. The weight of their shared secret continued to shape their engagement with the contemporary world, manifesting in a heightened sensitivity to manufactured consensus. Mina's artistic collaborations increasingly focused on decentralized network structures, attempting to build digital spaces that were inherently resistant to monolithic control. She often spoke of her work as creating cognitive antibodies, systems designed to recognize and reject patterns of imposed, singular authority. Emotionally, she carried a certain brisk impatience for anything that seemed too perfect or too easily accepted by the masses. She had seen the lethal potential hidden within flawless presentation. She found a quiet, rebellious joy in glitches, in the moment the system failed to uphold its own imposed order, viewing these breaks as tiny glimpses of genuine freedom. Jonathan, increasingly sought after for his expertise on historical structural failures, began to travel extensively, preferring the honesty of remote, ancient ruins to the polished, deceptive surfaces of modern metropolises. His relationship with time had fundamentally altered. He no longer rushed. When reviewing blueprints for proposed high-rise projects, he would spend hours examining the material stress reports, not just for safety compliance, but for what he termed the spiritual load, the implicit arrogance embedded in attempting to defy gravity and time on such a grand scale. He found a poignant kinship with the ghosts of long-dead craftsmen, men who knew their work would eventually crumble, but built it with dignity nonetheless. His quiet disapproval of the sleek, ephemeral nature of 2025 construction was a constant, low-level hum beneath his professional demeanor. Van Helsing's final act of preparation was subtle but comprehensive. He engineered a self-destruct mechanism for the Codex Umbra, designed to atomize the entire encrypted library if specific biometric or network intrusion signatures were detected. He understood that knowledge, even the knowledge of how to fight darkness, could become a weapon in the wrong hands. He entrusted the final access key, a complex algorithm based on a specific alignment of obscure celestial bodies noted in the Codex, to Mina, recognizing her unique blend of artistic intuition and analytical rigor as the most reliable guardian. His final correspondence with her was not a strategy document, but a philosophical reflection on acceptance. He argued that the true victory over the monstrous urge for immortality was the capacity to greet one's own ending with curiosity rather than terror, something Dracula was biologically incapable of achieving. The lasting impact of the adventure was a shared skepticism toward utopian narratives, particularly those promising effortless transcendence through technology. They saw the allure of eternal life not as a supernatural curse, but as a fundamental human flaw, the refusal to accept the limitations that define meaning. They lived their lives purposefully muted in the grand scheme, deliberately avoiding the spotlight that had consumed Lucy, understanding that obscurity was their most effective camouflage. Their existence became a quiet, lived argument that the fragile, ticking clock of a mortal life, filled with genuine, finite love and fleeting beauty, was infinitely richer than the sterile, endlessly repeating expanse of undeath. They were survivors who had traded the dream of conquering time for the grace of living within it. The trio's commitment to the ephemeral reality meant that their connections with the broader world became deliberately porous, allowing information out only when filtered through layers of plausible deniability. Mina, in particular, became adept at seeding conceptual art installations in unexpected public spaces, small, temporary digital projections that would flicker onto building facades late at night, displaying images that were beautiful precisely because they were inherently unstable, dissolving into static after mere seconds. These pieces were her passive resistance, tiny reminders to the sleeping city that permanence was an illusion that carried the highest price. She cultivated anonymity like a rare plant, understanding that the Count had thrived because he was a known, powerful entity. Her defense was to be an unknown, influential current. Jonathan's preservation projects often led him to remote locations where the noise of digital society barely penetrated. During a painstaking restoration of an ancient defensive wall in Eastern Europe, he noticed a local legend about the wall's builders. They were said to have intentionally incorporated minor structural flaws to ensure the wall would eventually fall, preventing it from ever being used by a tyrant to hold the populace captive. This story resonated deeply with his atonement, providing a philosophical blueprint for his architectural critique. True strength lies in the design's capacity for eventual, graceful obsolescence. He began lobbying for managed decay standards in urban planning, arguing that creating structures incapable of infinite maintenance forced societal renewal rather than stagnation, a direct antidote to Dracula's centuries-long stasis. Van Helsing, from his increasingly secluded academic retreat, focused his final energies on understanding the metaphysical infrastructure of belief. He hypothesized that entities like Dracula were not merely biological vampires, but parasitic concepts that found hosts in human frameworks of power, be it feudalism, mercantile capitalism, or digital monopoly. He compiled a final addendum to the Codex, labeling it The Persistence of Archetype, detailing how the idea of the immortal predator always reappears when societal structures become too rigid and centralized. He never sought public validation, content to have successfully poisoned the well of absolute certainty for those few who remained awake. His final, handwritten note to Mina spoke less of vampires and more of the necessity of human error. It is our glorious capacity to fail, my dear Mina, that prevents us from becoming gods. Cherish the mistakes. The final image of their continuing story is not one of triumphant peace, but of perpetual, nuanced engagement. They are three separate anchors holding the line against the tide of manufactured eternity. They move through the sleek, digitized world of 2025 like ghosts haunting the living, their greatest accomplishment being the conscious decision to remain mortal, finite, and deeply, beautifully flawed. They understood that the love story was never truly about romance or horror. It was an essay on the supreme value of the ticking second, meticulously observed and defended against the endless, cold promise of never-ending. The commitment to their fragile, finite reality fostered a subtle but profound shift in how they interacted with technology itself. Mina, now seeing digital space as a landscape riddled with unseen traps, developed a counter-aesthetic based on visual dissonance. Her work began to intentionally clash with the prevailing, smooth, emotionally neutral interfaces favored by major tech platforms. She introduced textures that felt deliberately abrasive to the eye, digital renderings of rough hemp, cracked earth, or tarnished metal, forcing the viewer to actively engage with the imperfection. This resistance was not merely aesthetic. It was a form of psychological inoculation against the seductive smoothness that had characterized Dracula's manipulation. She found that the more tactile and difficult her digital creations felt, the safer they seemed from ideological capture. Jonathan, while meticulously restoring historical structures, began a private project documenting architectural ghosts. Buildings that were demolished, but whose precise dimensions and material composition he could reconstruct based on fragmented historical records. He called this digital ghost work mourning in geometry. It allowed him to honor the past without being trapped by it, building monuments to what was lost in the fleeting cycles of progress. His greatest joy was finding that the old, imperfect materials often withstood modern stresses better than the hastily constructed, over-engineered glass towers he consulted on. This confirmed his belief that truth resided in authentic material history, not in the pursuit of flawless, future-proof design. He became quietly influential among preservationists for his insistence on retaining visible signs of wear and repair, framing them as evidence of resilience rather than failure. Van Helsing, as he finalized the encrypted dispersal protocols for the Codex Umbra, recognized that his most significant contribution was not the catalogue of monsters, but the philosophy embedded within it, the sanctity of natural limitation. He started conducting private symposiums, not for traditional academics, but for cutting-edge software developers and AI ethicists. He used the language of systems theory and thermodynamics, explaining that any closed, self-optimizing system, no matter how benevolent its initial coding, would eventually tend toward maximizing its own existence at the expense of external variables, the very definition of vampirism on a conceptual scale. His presence was commanding, not through volume, but through the unnerving clarity of his historical perspective. He convinced several key figures in neural network development to voluntarily build in entropy triggers into their foundational code, ensuring their creations could never achieve a static, self-serving permanence. The legacy of their struggle was cemented not in grand pronouncements, but in the steadfast normalcy they cultivated. They understood that the most effective defense against the eternal predator was the radical affirmation of the temporary. Their lives became a testament to the beauty found in the unrepeatable moment. The way Mina's laughter sounded now, slightly deeper after the ordeal, the specific, comforting weight of Jonathan's hand on her shoulder, the quiet satisfaction Van Helsing felt in knowing his warnings, however obscurely delivered, were taking root. They lived within the world of 2025, mastering its tools, yet remaining spiritually external to its most dangerous aspirations, proving that the greatest power lay not in controlling the narrative of forever, but in cherishing the brief, bright story of now. The final chapter of their shared vigilance settled into a pattern of informed, almost ritualistic suspicion. Mina, whose perception remained permanently sharpened, found a peculiar satisfaction in tracking emerging social trends that echoed Dracula's manipulative tactics. She noticed the rise of deeply immersive, personalized digital echo chambers, environments so perfectly tailored to individual desires that they mimicked the gilded cage of the Carpathian castle. Her art shifted again, now focusing on creating interactive, deprogramming modules, visual and auditory experiences designed to break the spell of hyper-personalization by introducing controlled, jarring elements of shared, objective reality. She treated the digital sphere like a contested territory, constantly scouting for breaches in collective awareness that the specter of eternal control might exploit again. Her primary motivation was ensuring that future generations would never mistake suffocating consensus for true connection. Jonathan's dedication to material history led him to an unexpected discovery while consulting on the stabilization of ancient Roman ruins in the Italian countryside. He unearthed fragments of pottery that, upon detailed analysis, contained microscopic traces of trace elements not native to the region, elements that Van Helsing's preliminary analyses of Dracula's Transylvanian lair had flagged as unusual metabolic byproducts. This discovery was tangible proof that Dracula's influence, his physical reality, was not confined to London or the East, but had subtly permeated the foundations of history through millennia of transient stops. Jonathan didn't publicize the finding. Instead, he used the data to refine his preservation models, arguing that preserving the material truth of a place was the only way to inoculate it against ideological pollution. He began teaching specialized workshops to young preservationists, emphasizing the importance of cataloging anomalies in material composition as potential signatures of historical corruption. Professor Van Helsing, recognizing the immense energy required to sustain the Codex Umbra, decided on a final act of deliberate diffusion. Rather than relying on a catastrophic self-destruct, he began the process of fragmenting the Codex into countless, innocuous-looking academic papers and minor footnotes scattered across obscure, peer-reviewed journals in linguistics, materials, science, and theoretical physics. This was not destruction, but camouflage, ensuring that the concentrated knowledge of how to combat such ancient evils would only be reassembled by minds that possessed the rigorous, multidisciplinary curiosity required to connect the disparate threads. He deliberately made the path to the knowledge complex, ensuring that only those truly committed to understanding complexity, rather than seeking easy answers, could ever reconstitute his life's work. His farewell to Mina and Jonathan was brief, emphasizing that the fight was now less about monsters and more about epistemology, the correct way to know the world. The final understanding that bound the three survivors was the recognition that they had not defeated the concept of eternal dominance, but had instead redefined their own mortality as a vital defense mechanism. They embraced the inherent imperfection of their short spans of life, the missed opportunities, the necessary mistakes, the inevitable decline, as the very qualities that made them unconquerable by an entity defined by the futile pursuit of the unending. They looked upon the hyper-optimized, superficially stable world of 2025 not with fear, but with a quiet, protective pity, knowing that the most beautiful stories are always those that, by necessity, must come to an end. The nascent cinematic endeavor, Dracula: A Love Tale 2025, presents a fascinating, if perhaps inevitable, recontextualization of Bram Stoker's immortal Count. This iteration leans heavily into the inherent romantic tragedy that has often been buried beneath layers of gothic horror and creature feature tropes. The casting choices alone suggest an aspiration toward nuanced emotional depth, moving beyond the one-dimensional predator. Consider the presumed trajectory of the titular character, presumably portrayed by an actor known for their capacity to convey profound loneliness masked by aristocratic veneer. Perhaps someone whose prior roles have explored themes of cursed longevity or unattainable affection. If the filmmakers adhere to the source material's undertones, the core tension lies not in the physical threat Dracula poses, but in the existential crisis of immortality shackled to perpetual yearning. The analysis of this film must therefore focus on how the screenplay navigates the inherently problematic dynamic of an ancient predator pursuing a contemporary woman. The selection of the lead actress, presumably embodying Mina Harker, or a similar figure of virginal yet intellectually vibrant desirability, is crucial. If the actress brings the intensity seen in her breakout independent features, where vulnerability was juxtaposed with steely resolve, the film gains an essential anchor. The conflict then shifts from simple escape to a genuine agonizing choice. Eternal, if monstrous, love versus mortal, flawed existence. This echoes the narrative concerns of earlier romantic tragedies, albeit infused with supernatural dread. The performance must balance the allure of immortality, freedom from decay, unparalleled knowledge, against the terrible cost, the subjugation of the self and the corruption of the beloved. Stylistically, the film seems poised to blend high-concept period detail with the slick, modern visual palette. The production design, informed perhaps by the visual language of modern European historical dramas, those impeccably framed shots emphasizing texture, shadow, and oppressive architecture, will be vital. We might anticipate a deliberate distancing from the overtly theatrical fog and bats of Hammer horror, opting instead for psychological claustrophobia. The shadows in this telling are less about jump scares and more about the creeping dread of internalized corruption. The inclusion of Van Helsing, often relegated to a zealous, one-dimensional antagonist, offers another critical avenue for analysis. If the creative team draws inspiration from actors who excel at portraying intellectual obsession bordering on mania, perhaps someone whose previous roles involved battling abstract, unseen forces, Van Helsing becomes the embodiment of mortal terror regarding change and the unknown. His pursuit is not just about saving a woman, it is about preserving the established order against an overwhelming, seductive antiquity. His methodology, whether relying on ancient lore or nascent scientific inquiry, will define the film's stance on progress versus tradition. The narrative success hinges on treating the romance as a genuine, seductive proposition, not merely a precursor to violence. The audience must believe, for a significant portion of the runtime, that the union between the Count and his chosen mortal could be a tragic, profound pairing, rather than a foregone act of vampirism. This requires meticulous pacing, allowing the slow burn of intellectual and emotional connection to develop before the inevitable, supernatural unveiling forces the climax. Any failure to establish this genuine emotional bond renders the entire endeavor a predictable exercise in period horror, failing to live up to the promise inherent in its title. A love tale. The 2025 rendition must wrestle with the inherent narcissism of an immortal demanding eternal companionship, transforming a monster movie into a profound exploration of desire, sacrifice, and the ultimate incompatibility of forever. The success of this romantic framing demands a deep dive into Dracula's presumed backstory, leveraging the actor's demonstrated ability to convey accumulated regret. If the casting director selected an artist known for portraying characters burdened by historical baggage, perhaps someone who has masterfully navigated complex morality plays or historical epics where personal survival clashed with societal expectation, the characterization deepens considerably. We are not just observing a blood feeder. We are witnessing a soul weary of centuries, whose acts of cruelty are perhaps misguided attempts to resurrect a single moment of lost human connection. This weariness must translate visually. The Count's movements should suggest immense physical grace overlaid with an almost unbearable psychic weight. The object of his fixation, the mortal heroine, needs an actress whose filmography reflects a mastery of internal monologue, suggesting a rich, complex inner life that makes her susceptible not just to glamour, but to the sheer intellectual novelty Dracula offers. Imagine an actress whose previous work has showcased an intense fascination with forgotten histories or esoteric knowledge. For her, Dracula is not just a lover, but the ultimate key to unlocking the mysteries she spends her mortal life chasing. This attraction must be rooted in intellectual recognition. She sees in his ancient eyes the answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. Her transformation, therefore, is less about forced subjugation and more about a voluntary surrender to absolute knowledge, a final, glorious examination. Furthermore, the emotional landscape of the film will be defined by the setting, likely an atmospheric contrast between the decaying grandeur of Dracula's ancestral seat and the stifling propriety of Victorian or contemporary London society from which the heroine must be extracted. If the production design echoes the claustrophobic beauty favored by directors known for their meticulous historical reconstruction, where every piece of furniture and every shadow placement communicates social constraint, the flight with Dracula represents a liberation, however terrifying. The visual juxtaposition between the ornate tomb and the clean modern lines of the world she leaves behind will symbolize the battle between suffocating tradition and seductive transgression. The film must also explore the inherent toxicity of a relationship built on inherent imbalance, likely drawing upon contemporary psychological thrillers that examine power dynamics in intense pairings. The audience needs to feel the seduction while simultaneously recognizing the trap. If the director has a background in intense character studies, perhaps employing handheld camera work during intimate moments to inject a subtle sense of unease, even when Dracula is being tender, this subtextual horror will elevate the narrative. The tenderness must always feel provisional, a temporary ceasefire before the inevitable reassertion of the predator's nature. The emotional climax, then, should not simply be the final confrontation, but the moment the heroine understands the true nature of the eternity Dracula offers. Not shared existence, but endless observation of her own finite humanity receding. Her final decision, whether to embrace the cold immortality or choose the swift, bright end of mortal life, must be framed as the ultimate act of self-definition against a force that seeks to absorb her identity entirely. This is where the film transcends genre. It becomes a meditation on whether true love requires the preservation of self or the annihilation of self into another. The success of this ambitious reimagining hinges critically on the screenplay's handling of time itself as a narrative device, something an actor of Dracula's assumed caliber, with a history of playing figures grappling with the weight of epochs, can exploit masterfully. His boredom, that silent enemy lurking beneath his polished demeanor, must be palpable in every extended silence, every deliberate gesture. If the actor is known for minimalist expressions that convey maximal internal turmoil, think of those performers who rely on the slight downturn of an eye or the barely perceptible tightening of the jaw. Dracula's millennia of accumulated loss will become the film's emotional bedrock. This is not the vanity of the monster, but the profound exhaustion of someone who has seen every human drama play out countless times, finding true novelty only in the singular spirit of his chosen mortal. The heroine's susceptibility, conversely, must stem from a profound dissatisfaction with the temporal limitations of her own era. If the actress has specialized in portraying characters who feel intellectually orphaned by their surroundings, constantly ahead of their time, her immediate connection with Dracula becomes logical. He is the living archive, the only being who can truly engage with her most radical thoughts without condescension. The attraction here is intellectual symbiosis before it is romantic predation. Imagine the cinematic language used to depict their shared moments, perhaps long takes where the camera circles them slowly in an otherwise sterile modern environment, suggesting that Dracula creates a bubble of ancient significance around them, temporarily warping reality to accommodate their incompatible timelines. Van Helsing's evolution must parallel this intellectual intensity. If the actor playing him has a background in portraying fiercely rational scientists or morally rigid protagonists whose certainty is their defining flaw, perhaps known for roles where they dismantled complex systems only to find themselves undone by emotion, his pursuit of Dracula becomes a desperate attempt to impose order on chaos. His motivation isn't just saving the girl, It's refuting the seductive possibility that the old world, the supernatural order, holds more truth than the enlightenment he champions. His increasing desperation, reflected perhaps in a slight physical deterioration as he exhausts himself fighting an eternal being, will serve as a crucial counterpoint to Dracula's ageless calm. The crucial emotional beat will occur when the heroine realizes that Dracula's gift of eternal life is predicated on stasis. For a vibrant, evolving intellect, perpetuity means the cessation of growth. The romance curdles when she understands that Dracula doesn't want her to join him in eternity. He wants her to freeze-frame her perfection at the moment he first desired her. This realization must hit her with the force of a physical blow, likely filmed in a way that strips the preceding Gothic opulence bare, leaving only stark, cold reality. The film's emotional core transforms from forbidden love into a desperate fight for agency against eternal domestication. The resulting conflict is deeply resonant with modern anxieties about conformity and the pressure to maintain an idealized self, simply writ large across centuries of vampiric possessiveness. The visual grammar employed to contrast the Count's ancient world with the heroine's present must extend beyond mere set dressing. It should define the very texture of their emotional experiences. If the director shares sensibilities with those who emphasize tactile realism in their historical settings, Dracula's castle interiors should feel heavy, richly layered with dust, velvet, and the scent of old wood and dried blood, a realm where every object has a memory. This overwhelming physicality contrasts sharply with the heroine's contemporary environment, which, while perhaps aesthetically pleasing in its minimalism, should feel thin, almost insubstantial, reflecting a world stripped of deep, palpable history. When she is drawn into his realm, the film should use shallow focus and dramatic chiaroscuro to emphasize how Dracula's world consumes her senses, making her own reality seem fleeting and immaterial by comparison. This sensory overload is the true anesthetic that dulls her rational judgment. The film's approach to sexuality, given the inherent themes of possession and forbidden desire, requires extreme delicacy, especially considering the presumed lead actress's established persona, favoring nuanced portrayals over overt sensationalism. If her previous work has shown an ability to communicate powerful erotic tension through glances and near touches, the unspoken language of longing, this dynamic will be far more compelling than explicit depiction. Dracula's attraction must manifest as an intense, almost painful form of worship for her vitality, something he no longer possesses. The scene where he first physically touches her, perhaps tracing the lines of her hand or neck, must be imbued with the reverence of a priest approaching a sacred relic, underscoring that for him, she is the embodiment of the life he traded away. This act of touching must feel both violating in its power imbalance and intoxicating in its intimacy. Furthermore, the role of secondary characters, specifically those orbiting the heroine in her mortal life, perhaps a conventional, well-meaning suitor or a close female friend who represents the safety of the ordinary, must be elevated beyond mere narrative obstacles. If the actor playing the suitor excels at portraying grounded decency, coupled with an understandable inability to comprehend the heroine's intellectual restlessness, his presence serves as the audience's anchor to rational reality. His concern, dismissed by the heroine as mundane jealousy, is in fact the sound of a healthy life continuing. His scenes should be bathed in natural light, a deliberate visual antithesis to the moonlit, eternal twilight that envelops the Count and his beloved. The tragedy is cemented when the heroine must actively choose the suffocating beauty of the shadow over the clear, uncomplicated light of the ordinary, a choice that isolates her completely from human empathy. The analysis must also account for the film's likely use of sound design to externalize the internal conflict. Dracula's presence could be accompanied by a subtle, low-frequency hum or the almost imperceptible sound of deep earth shifting, a constant reminder of his antiquity and unnatural state. Conversely, the heroine's moments of clarity or resistance could be scored by sudden incursions of sharp, high-frequency sounds, the clang of a mundane bell, the sharp snap of a closing book, reminders of the structured, measurable world she is abandoning. This auditory landscape will subtly guide the audience's allegiance, forcing them to feel the seduction and the terror simultaneously through the carefully engineered environment. The thematic resonance of Dracula, A Love Tale 2025, will ultimately be judged by how convincingly it portrays the corrosive nature of obsession when filtered through an immortal lens. If the director has a pedigree in psychological dramas exploring codependency, the film could achieve a devastating intimacy. Dracula's love is not altruistic. It is a colossal act of self-preservation, cloaked in romance. He requires her spirit to stave off his own dissolution into meaninglessness. This desperation must occasionally fracture his composure, perhaps during moments when the heroine asserts her own will too strongly. An actor trained in method acting, capable of accessing profound reservoirs of suppressed rage or grief, can ensure that Dracula's tenderness is always laced with potential violence, a smile that never quite reaches eyes, burdened by endless remembrance. The contemporary setting, assumed to be integrated into the narrative fabric rather than merely a backdrop, offers a chance to satirize modern superficiality through Dracula's ancient eyes. If the heroine is, for instance, a social media influencer or a consultant obsessed with optimizing her own ephemeral existence, Dracula's offer of true, unchanging significance becomes overwhelmingly attractive. His disdain for the fleeting nature of digital fame or quarterly reports provides a profound philosophical counterpoint to her modern malaise. The scenes where he subtly manipulates her technology, perhaps causing her digital records to glitch or her online presence to briefly vanish, are potent metaphors for his ability to erase her from her own constructed reality. Van Helsing's narrative arc, viewed through the lens of an actor known for playing figures battling intellectual stagnation, will become increasingly tragic. As he closes in, his methods must become more desperate, perhaps incorporating elements of modern surveillance or psychological profiling alongside traditional lore, demonstrating that his fight is as much against the seductive philosophy of immortality as it is against the physical creature. If his actor previously excelled in portraying brilliant minds slowly succumbing to paranoia, perhaps characters whose pursuit of truth led them into isolation, his obsession with destroying Dracula will mirror Dracula's own obsessive focus, creating a dark, parallel symmetry between hunter and hunted. He becomes the cautionary tale of the mortal who sacrifices everything human in the attempt to understand the inhuman. Finally, the visual culmination of the romance must avoid the pitfalls of fairy tale grandeur. If the narrative leans into the stark reality of the transformation, should the heroine choose damnation, the visual effects must prioritize body horror mingled with tragic beauty. We should see the loss of light in her eyes before the fangs descend, the physical transformation being less a magnificent change and more a painful, necessary sacrifice of her vibrant individuality to match his cold permanence. The true love story here is the mutual acknowledgement of their respective prisons, his eternal, hers newly forged. The lingering shot should not be of a triumphant, powerful couple, but of two beings forever separated from humanity, bound by a terrible, shared history that grants them no true peace, only endless continuation. The emotional architecture of this film necessitates a careful delineation of power transfer, which cannot be solely physical. It must be ideological. If the actress portraying the heroine has a background in portraying activists or figures who triumph through sustained internal resistance against systemic pressure, her eventual surrender or perceived capitulation will carry immense weight. Her struggle is the contemporary fight against commodification and the societal pressure to define oneself through external validation. Dracula offers the ultimate escape from the tyranny of perception. He sees her essence, unmediated by social constructs, and this perceived clarity is the ultimate aphrodisiac for a modern, overanalyzed individual. The film must make the audience feel the intoxicating relief of being utterly known and accepted by a being outside the judgment of society. This dynamic elevates the role of atmosphere during their intimate scenes. The color palette, when they are together, should shift from the oppressive darkness of the castle to something unnervingly luminous, perhaps filtered through aged, thick glass, a light that is perpetual twilight, neither day nor night. This visual choice reflects the suspension of normal, temporal, and moral rules. If the cinematographer has a history of creating dreamlike, almost hypnotic sequences, these scenes should feel less like seduction and more like a shared descent into a profoundly beautiful hallucination, one where the heroine willingly trades linear progression for eternal moment. The film's exploration of memory becomes paramount. Dracula is the keeper of dead time, and the heroine risks becoming his living archive, a repository for his historical narrative. An actor of Dracula's stature, particularly one who has tackled roles requiring long monologues about historical injustice or personal betrayal, will infuse his recounting of past tragedies with a raw, immediate pain that convinces the heroine that her mortal griefs are insignificant compared to his, thus rendering her life small and disposable next to his eternity. Her eventual choice becomes a philosophical debate. Is a short, intensely felt life superior to a long, emotionally muted existence, serving as a footnote in an immortal's diary? Van Helsing's fanaticism must be shown as stemming from a deep-seated fear of obsolescence. If his actor has played figures whose entire identity was wrapped up in scientific dogma or rigid belief systems, perhaps someone known for portraying characters whose certainty fractures under existential strain, his increasing reliance on brutal action over reasoned debate will symbolize the mortal mind's inability to process concepts beyond its comprehension. He represents the desperate, clinging to the quantifiable world. His attempts to destroy Dracula are futile because he is trying to kill an idea that has already taken root in the heroine's most profound desires. His failure is the failure of Enlightenment rationalism to account for the seduction of the sublime and the eternal. Ultimately, the film must resolve whether the love tale is a genuine connection or the most elaborate trap ever devised. If the final confrontation leaves the audience uncertain as to whether the heroine was saved or merely deferred her damnation, the film achieves its highest analytical potential. The lingering image should not be of a stake-driven home or a triumphant embrace, but perhaps of the heroine, now transformed, looking back at the space where her mortal life existed with a flicker of regret, instantly suppressed by the terrifying majesty of her new, unending commitment. This nuanced ambiguity elevates the piece from simple horror to a sophisticated tragedy about the unbearable weight of boundless possibility. The psychological impact of Dracula's influence on the heroine demands a granular examination, especially concerning the suppression of her autonomy. If the actress excels at portraying characters whose resilience is worn down through subtle, insidious pressure, the kind of performance where the audience witnesses a spirit slowly being sandblasted away rather than broken suddenly, the film achieves its greatest pathos. Dracula's control is initially manifested as unparalleled intellectual validation, but this validation is inherently conditional. He admires her youth and spirit only insofar as they remain tethered to his eternal narrative. The film should dedicate significant time to the moments where her emerging desires conflict with his ancient, immutable expectations, showing these as tiny, agonizing fractures in the supposed perfection of their bond. Perhaps a scene where she attempts to introduce a piece of modern music or art that he dismisses as frivolous noise, instantly reminding her of the vast cultural chasm separating them. The internal conflict within the heroine, the last vestiges of her mortal self fighting the seductive pull of permanence, should be visually externalized through costume and physical blocking. Early on, her attire might be sharp, defined, and tailored, symbols of her control over her own presentation. As the film progresses, and she yields more to the count, her clothing might become softer, flowing, almost diaphanous, reflecting a dissolving sense of self and rigid structure. In their final confrontations, when she must choose, her posture must physically convey the tension between her natural desire for forward momentum, growth, change, and the imposed stillness of vampiric eternity. If the lead actress is known for her physical expressiveness, she can communicate volumes through the simple act of standing. Is she leaning into his shadow, or attempting to stand upright in a light that no longer favors her? Van Helsing's descent into obsession must also register as a form of premature death, a mortal imitation of Dracula's curse. If the actor playing the professor has a career marked by portraying characters deeply invested in systems of order, be they legal, scientific, or theological, his inability to categorize or control the count will force him into a state of spiritual chaos. His study or laboratory, once a sanctuary of empirical fact, should begin to look like a shrine to impending doom, cluttered with increasingly desperate and occult references, symbolizing the bankruptcy of pure reason in the face of overwhelming, seductive antiquity. His character arc serves as a necessary, tragic commentary. In striving to save the mortal spirit, he sacrifices his own capacity for balanced existence, becoming almost as monomaniacal as the entity he hunts. The film's climax, regardless of the outcome, needs to avoid the bombast of typical action sequences. The true battle is existential. If the resolution is tragic and ambiguous, perhaps orchestrated by a director who favors quiet, devastating endings over noisy resolutions, the final image should focus on absence. If she chooses mortality, the horror lies in her return to a world suddenly rendered flat and meaningless without the towering significance of the count. If she chooses him, the horror is the chilling lack of evolution. The beauty of their embrace is immediately undercut by the realization that this moment will be repeated, identically, for the next 10,000 years. The narrative ambition here lies in making the audience mourn the loss of possibility, whether that possibility was a brief, vibrant life, or an eternal life that is fundamentally static. The film's success hinges on the precise calibration of Dracula's allure, ensuring it functions as a sophisticated form of intellectual and existential temptation rather than mere surface-level magnetism. If the actor selected possesses the gravitas built from portraying figures who have profoundly shaped history, his every pronouncement should carry the weight of witnessed millennia. His seduction is the offering of context, a vast, unfiltered understanding of the human condition that no mortal scholar can provide. This requires dialogue that is both profoundly archaic in its cadence and startlingly modern in its philosophical insight, allowing the heroine, presumably a woman whose career reflects a mastery of complex, abstract thought, to engage with him as an intellectual equal, albeit one standing outside the boundaries of conventional reality. The audience must believe that, in his presence, time dilates, and the trivialities of her former life genuinely evaporate, making his proposition a compelling shortcut to profound wisdom. The visual representation of their communion must emphasize the shared state of being outsiders. When they convene, perhaps in liminal spaces like deserted libraries late at night or misty, forgotten gardens, the lighting should be exquisitely controlled, suggesting they exist in a perpetual twilight that shelters them from the harsh judgment of the sunlit, ordinary world. This shared sanctuary is vital. It's a constructed reality where her mortality is temporarily suspended by the sheer force of his attention. If the cinematographer has a history of using deep focus to emphasize environmental detail, these shared moments should utilize that technique to underscore how every element of Dracula's domain speaks to a history she desperately wants to inherit, making her mortal surroundings appear shallow and ill-defined by comparison. Van Helsing's motivation, framed through an actor with a strong background in playing morally compromised crusaders or brilliant individuals whose certainty has curdled into zealotry, must be rooted in fear of the seductive alternative. He doesn't just fear the monster, he fears the compelling logic of Dracula's philosophy, the idea that immortality justifies amorality. His pursuit is less about heroism and more about proving that the messy, finite reality of human striving holds greater ultimate value than cold, eternal perfection. We should see this strain in his personal life. Perhaps neglected family ties or a reliance on increasingly unstable methods, indicating that his obsession is already consuming the very humanity he claims to defend. His eventual confrontation with the couple should feel less like a triumphant battle and more like an awkward, intrusive interruption of a deep, albeit dangerous, intimacy. The narrative climax must confront the ultimate question of desire. What is the true cost of having one's deepest yearning fulfilled by a being fundamentally incapable of human reciprocity? If the heroine chooses eternity, the film must immediately pivot to demonstrate the subtle, soul-crushing monotony that follows. The initial rapturous quality of their union must dissipate, revealing the cold mechanics of their new existence. Her transformation should be visually marked by the slow fading of her vibrant eye color, replaced by the polished, reflective sheen of prolonged undeath, signifying the loss of internal fire. The love story concludes not with passion, but with mutual, elegant resignation to a shared, beautiful prison. The final emotional resonance should stem from the terrifying realization that to love an immortal utterly is to agree to become timelessly incomplete, forever reaching for the emotional depth that only mortality allows. The delicate balance of the film's romantic premise rests heavily on establishing Dracula not as a simplistic villain, but as the ultimate tragic figure whose charisma is born directly from unbearable isolation. If the actor carries the experience of portraying characters who have successfully navigated centuries of political and cultural upheaval, someone whose mastery of human behavior is born from endless observation, his every gesture will be imbued with profound, melancholic economy. His love for the heroine must be framed as a desperate act of intellectual resurrection. She is the first true anomaly in an endless sequence of predictable human cycles he has witnessed. The texture of their initial interactions must emphasize a rare, shared intellectual frequency where mundane conversation is abandoned in favor of exploring vast, shared conceptual landscapes. This requires the script to give Dracula moments where his mask slips, revealing not monstrous hunger, but profound ancient fatigue, making his desire for her less about feeding and more about anchoring himself to something new before he dissolves entirely into historical dust. The heroine's immersion into his world must be depicted as a willing, almost enthusiastic surrender to complexity, appealing to an actress known for conveying intense interiority and a rebellious spirit against simplistic narratives. Her attraction is not merely to power, but to the sheer, unedited truth of existence that Dracula embodies, a truth unavailable in the sterilized narratives of her own time. The cinematic language used during their private moments should reflect this, perhaps using soft focus and warm amber tones that contrast sharply with the cold blues and sharp contrasts of her former, mundane life. However, this warmth must always feel provisional, like a candle flame dangerously close to a draft. The audience needs to feel the seductive logic of choosing endless experience over finite safety, even as they recognize the inherent threat to her burgeoning individuality. Van Helsing's antagonism must be portrayed as the shadow of his own unfulfilled potential. If the actor has a history of playing meticulous, driven professionals whose lives are defined by measurable results, his character's breakdown when faced with the supernatural should be excruciatingly personal. He perceives Dracula not just as a killer, but as a living refutation of every scientific principle he has built his life upon. His pursuit becomes a desperate quest to re-establish epistemological order. We should see him losing his own grounding, his precise methodologies becoming ragged, his appearance mirroring the chaos he seeks to expel. His tragedy lies in his inability to grasp that some truths cannot be staked or burned. They must be understood, a concept that his rigid, mortal framework cannot accommodate. He is fighting the seduction of the unknown by violently asserting the known. The film's success ultimately relies on portraying the inherent narcissism required for an immortal to demand eternal love. When the heroine realizes that her eternity with him means becoming an unchanging artifact in his collection rather than an active participant in a shared future, the romance collapses into existential horror. This realization should be signaled not by a dramatic argument, but by a subtle shift in Dracula's gaze. The moment he stops looking at her and starts looking through her, already perceiving her as part of his permanent, unchanging landscape. The final tragedy is that in seeking escape from the triviality of mortal time, she has entered a far more absolute form of triviality: endless repetition. The film should conclude not with catharsis, but with a lingering sense of profound cold symmetry between the predator and the self-sacrificed beloved, forever trapped in a beautifully curated moment. The exploration of transference and projection within this doomed relationship is paramount for elevating the narrative beyond simple Gothic romance into true psychological drama. Dracula does not see the heroine as she is, but projects onto her the memory of an idealized, perhaps even lost, version of humanity that he believes he can reclaim through her vitality. This demands an actor capable of conveying immense, almost desperate need beneath the mask of patrician control. If the performer has previously excelled in roles requiring complex emotional transference, perhaps portraying mentors whose affection borders on smothering possession, Dracula's tenderness will appear profoundly unstable, forever teetering on the brink of demanding absolute compliance. His compliments should sound like meticulously crafted chains, binding her not with affection, but with the weight of his historical approval. The heroine's internal landscape, when faced with this overwhelming veneration, must reveal her own deep-seated desire to be defined by something grander than her contemporary existence. If the actress's filmography suggests a deep fascination with literary figures who choose art or obsession over conventional happiness, her attraction to Dracula will be interpreted as choosing the ultimate, albeit monstrous, narrative over a quiet life. The emotional payoff for the audience will be in witnessing the gradual corrosion of her independent voice. Scenes where she begins to parrot Dracula's ancient perspectives or adopt his archaic mannerisms, seemingly willingly, will be the most chilling indicators of her spiritual absorption. This is not just falling in love. It is the voluntary dissolution of the self into a more compelling mythology. The thematic undercurrent of cultural clash, visualized through the contrast between Dracula's preserved world and the heroine's rapidly evolving modernity, needs sharp focus. If the production design leans toward a hyperrealism, making the modern world feel almost aggressively bright and brittle, Dracula's sanctuary offers a seductive, velvety darkness, a historical cocoon against the anxieties of progress. The sound design, therefore, must amplify this contrast. The sharp, digitized alerts of the modern world should grate against the deep, resonant silence that permeates the Count's domain. When the heroine is fully enveloped by him, the ambient sound should become muted, emphasizing a world slowing down specifically for her, offering the ultimate, albeit false, promise of escape from the relentless march of time. Van Helsing's relentless pursuit must articulate the moral panic of the modern age, confronting the incomprehensible past. If the actor's prior work includes portraying figures wrestling with societal collapse or the failure of established institutions, his desperation to maintain the integrity of the known world will be palpable. His attempts to use logic or newly developed weaponry against Dracula should consistently fail in ways that highlight the supernatural's transcendence of human effort. His character becomes a symbol for the inherent limitations of mortal ambition when pitted against entities that operate outside linear causality. His final actions should not be triumphant heroism, but a sad, futile gesture signifying the defeat of rationalism in the face of an overwhelming romanticized darkness. The film should leave the audience contemplating whether Van Helsing's rigidity blinds him to a deeper, if terrifying, form of transcendent connection that the heroine willingly embraced. The film's exploration of sacrifice must be meticulously handled, ensuring that the heroine's eventual choice, whether toward or away from the Count, is framed not as coercion, but as a devastating philosophical decision about the nature of meaning itself. If the actress has cultivated a screen persona defined by fierce moral clarity, her gradual compromise will register as a profound, personal betrayal. We must see moments where she actively rejects the easy comfort of her mortal attachments, convincing both herself and the audience that the stakes are truly existential. Dracula, in turn, must present the ultimate trade, the fleeting, messy vibrancy of human feeling, for the cold, perfected certainty of unending awareness. His love language, therefore, is not expressed through typical romance, but through the dissemination of forbidden knowledge and the granting of unparalleled perspective, tempting the rational mind into embracing the irrational. The visual realization of the heroine's transformation, assuming she succumbs to the proposal, should employ techniques that suggest an internal petrification rather than simple biological change. If the director favors intimate, unsettling close-ups, the audience should witness the light dimming behind her eyes, the subtle loss of expressive elasticity in her face, long before the more obvious vampiric markers manifest. This visual language should subtly mirror the oppressive textures of Dracula's castle, the way velvet absorbs all light, the way ancient stone resists change. She becomes a flawless, beautiful statue, a perfect aesthetic object, immune to the messy process of living, which is precisely what Dracula desires, an eternal witness to his own continued existence, untainted by growth or descent. Van Helsing's inevitable failure needs to feel earned by his own narrow perspective. If the actor brings the intensity of a man who has spent his life meticulously categorizing the world, his inability to categorize Dracula should dismantle his very identity. His methods must become increasingly esoteric and emotionally driven, showing a shift from the scientist to the mystic, a capitulation to the very forces he seeks to destroy. His final moments should find him confronting the realization that his crusade, born of a desire to save humanity's future, has only succeeded in driving the most fascinating element of it into the arms of the past. His defeat symbolizes the mortal mind's inherent limitation when attempting to legislate the transcendent. The profound tragedy of Dracula. A Love Tale 2025 will reside in the film's final, lingering ambiguity regarding freedom. If the heroine chooses immortality, the film should not depict them as conquering figures, but as two exquisitely dressed prisoners in a shared gilded cage. The final scene, perhaps focusing on a landscape they both observe, should show a world continuing to evolve, change, and experience genuine novelty, a world they are now perpetually excluded from observing organically. Their connection, once the source of exhilarating possibility, solidifies into an eternal, beautiful stagnation. The love story resolves itself as the ultimate commentary on possessiveness. The deepest form of love, when wielded by an immortal, is the desire to arrest the beloved entirely, freezing their beauty at the moment of highest potential, thereby ensuring that the tale never actually continues, only repeats. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Smiling Frame channel. Please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up if you enjoy the content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Dracula, A Love Tale 2025. The year is 2025, and the familiar gothic gloom of Bram Stoker's classic tale is refracted through a modern lens in Dracula, A Love Tale. We find ourselves not just in Victorian London, but navigating the sleek, high-stakes world of international finance and digital artistry, where the ancient thirst for control meets the contemporary hunger for immortality through influence. Our Count Dracula, now portrayed with a chilling, understated elegance, is less a monstrous brute and more a titan of industry. He has spent centuries cultivating an empire, his true nature hidden behind the carefully constructed facade of a reclusive billionaire investor. This iteration of Dracula, steeped in the melancholic wisdom of endless life, finds his focus drawn not just to sustenance, but to a profound, almost intellectual longing for connection that he has long suppressed. Enter Mina Harker, whose modern counterpart is not a simple schoolmistress, but a brilliant, rising star in digital art and virtual reality design. Inspired perhaps by the early pioneers of interactive media, her work is deeply evocative, weaving complex emotional narratives into immersive digital spaces. She possesses a sharp, almost intuitive understanding of human connection, a quality that immediately intrigues the ancient predator. Her fiancé, Jonathan Harker, is depicted as a driven, perhaps overly ambitious young architect whose relentless pursuit of a career-defining project in Eastern Europe unknowingly leads him directly into Dracula's ancestral domain. The initial encounter, the journey to the shadowed castle, feels less like a kidnapping and more like a seduction into a gilded cage of historical grandeur and intellectual stimulation. Dracula, drawing on centuries of accumulated knowledge, engages Jonathan in debates on art, history, and the fleeting nature of human endeavor, subtly weakening the young man's resolve and setting the stage for his own corruption. When Dracula arrives in London, the atmosphere shifts from isolated horror to pervasive urban anxiety. He doesn't stalk shadows so much as he subtly manipulates market trends and social networks. His arrival mirrors the infiltration of a powerful, unregulated corporation into the delicate ecosystem of London society. The introduction of Lucy Westenra, Mina's close friend, is vital. In this version, Lucy is portrayed as an influential social media personality whose vibrant public life makes her an irresistible target, a beacon whose essence, when drained, promises a particularly potent form of vital energy. Her slow decline is agonizingly modern. The symptoms are initially dismissed as stress, fatigue, or the side effects of an obsessive digital lifestyle, until the true blood-soaked pattern emerges. The arrival of Professor Abraham Van Helsing is a masterstroke of casting. He is not merely an old academic, but a retired but highly respected forensic psychologist and expert in obscure historical belief systems, perhaps having cut his teeth analyzing cold cases rooted in folklore before turning to academia. His methods are meticulous, blending modern psychological profiling with ancient lore. He recognizes the pattern where the authorities see only a string of bizarre medical anomalies. The hunt for Dracula becomes a collaborative effort between this enlightened scientific mind and the desperate figures around Mina and Jonathan. Mina, reeling from Jonathan's terrifying experiences and Lucy's tragic demise, finds herself drawn into Van Helsing's investigation, her artistic mind providing unusual insights into the psychology of the hunter. The climax trades dusty crypts for sterile, high-tech environments, perhaps a subterranean server farm or a forgotten vault beneath Dracula's London headquarters. The pursuit is driven by logic, deduction, and a desperate race against the clock. Dracula's connection to Mina deepens throughout this chase. He sees in her not just a victim or prey, but a potential partner, someone whose vibrant creativity could revitalize his stagnant eternity. He attempts to bridge the vast chasm between his immortal cynicism and her passionate human existence. In the final confrontation, the destruction of Dracula is handled with a tragic inevitability. It is less a glorious slaying and more a necessary mournful severing of an ancient tether. His defeat is achieved not just through stakes and sunlight, but through the unwavering conviction of human love and intellectual clarity that Mina and Van Helsing embody. The lingering impression is that while the monster is gone, the allure of that dark, eternal power, the seductive promise of escaping the mundane boundaries of life, remains a potent, dangerous idea in the modern world. The pervasive sense of dread that settles over 2025 London after Dracula's arrival is palpable, echoing the anxieties of an interconnected society suddenly aware of how easily its foundations can be undermined by unseen forces. Count Dracula's elegance, as we observe him navigating charity galas and exclusive art auctions, is almost a performance art in itself. He moves through these spaces not seeking attention, but absorbing influence, his centuries spent observing humanity having honed him into the ultimate social engineer. One can almost picture him having quietly financed pivotal scientific discoveries throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, not for the science itself, but for the residual power it granted him in the modern era. His pallor is not merely lack of sun, it is the deep, tired look of someone who has seen every human drama played out countless times, leaving him perpetually detached, yet yearning for genuine novelty. Mina Harker's artistic career is defined by her pursuit of authentic immersion. Having trained initially in classical architecture, a subtle nod to her fiancé's profession, she pivoted when she realized digital space allowed for instantaneous, total emotional transfer, a feat physical reality always denied her. Her vulnerability stems from this very intensity. She throws herself into her creations with a desperate sincerity that Dracula perceives as raw, unfiltered life force. When she first studies the subtle, almost imperceptible changes in Jonathan after his return from the Carpathians, her forensic analysis of his trauma mirrors the very techniques Van Helsing will later employ. She sees cracks in his digital facade that others miss. Jonathan Harker, the architect, is shown in flashbacks struggling under the pressure of his ambition. We see him in sterile, illuminated construction sites, his blueprints representing an ordered world he desperately wants to impose on chaos. His trip to Transylvania was meant to secure a commission involving the restoration